Hello everyone, I'm Mike Langlois of the University of Buffalo School of Social Work. Welcome to the third installment of Social Work Tech Now. Social Work Tech Now is a multimedia series created to engage social work faculty and practitioners around increasing their use and understanding of emerging technologies. Put simply, this series seeks to answer the question, why does technology and innovation matter to social work? This year we've been bringing you a series of speakers and presentations which explore race, racism, and emerging technology. Starting with the webinar, What White People Need to Know About Black Twitter, we explored the use of Twitter as a platform to leverage race awareness and Black culture. Our second presentation, The Prep School Negro, screened and allowed us to discuss racial diversity and identity in education in the 20th century and today. You'll be able to find both of these shortly at our website at University of Buffalo. So today in our third installment, we'll be taking a look at race representation both in video games and in the video game industry. But first, a few housekeeping details. We've taken a screenshot as an example of the attendee interface. You should see something that looks like this on your own computer desktop in the upper right corner. You've joined the presentation listening using your computer speaker system by default. If you'd prefer to join over the telephone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be explained. You'll have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions page on the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We'll be collecting these and addressing them through the Q&A as a part of today's presentation. In addition, you might be seeing some Twitter feed that will have hashtag #RaceVideoGames, and if you're following us on Twitter, you can also submit questions that way, and we'll type them in so that people can see them and hopefully answer them. So let's get started. The Entertainment Software Association estimates that approximately 155 million Americans play video games on a regular basis. 4 out of 5 households own a gaming console, and over a quarter of the players are children and adolescents. The average time spent playing each week seems to hover around 5 to 6.5 hours, depending on the research. And the number of sequels of games, ranging from the Mario series to Call of Duty, testifies to the loyal following many games have over time. In 2015, a Pew Research survey found that, quote, fully 47% of adults say they are not sure whether video games portray minority groups poorly. Almost a quarter of all adults, 23%, think most video games do not portray minority groups poorly, more than double the 9% of adults who do think they're portrayed poorly in video games. So what does that mean for the more than half of gamers who are Black or Hispanic? And how do we make sense of how race is represented both in video games and in the industry that creates them? Here to help me answer these questions and other questions are Kishonna Gray, James Ivory, and Price Jones. Dr. Gray is currently a Martin Luther King Visiting Scholar in Women and Gender Studies and Comparative Media Studies writing at MIT. She is also the founder of the Critical Gaming Lab at Eastern Kentucky University. Her most recent book is Race, Gender, and Deviance in Xbox Live. Dr. Ivory is an associated professor of communication at Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University, and has written and researched a series of systematic content analyses documenting race and other demographics in video games, as well as a series of field experiments documenting sex stereotype behavior in online game interactions. And Professor Jones is currently the MFA Director of the School of Game Development at the Academy of Art University in San Francisco, and was a core contributor to video games including Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers, Bloodwake, Tomb Raider, Legend, and Shrek Super Slam. So welcome, everybody.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello, thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
So let's start with those Pew statistics and get your ideas. How do you think people of color are portrayed in video games in general?
Yeah, I think the portrayals have they've changed, but they've consistently remained the same as well, right? You know, whenever I go back and look at historical games, there was just a lot of non-representation, right? And then when it was, people speak in very stereotypical manners, but people were just glad to see it. You know, I'm thinking about the first time I think I saw a person of color in a video game was probably Mike Tyson's Punch-Out. But that kind of covered like a variety of cultures in very stereotypical ways, like this monstrous third world other or effeminate other, thinking about like the French, you know, kind of character. So that I think representations overall have come a long way, you know, if you will. So I think we've gone away from a lot of those tropes, but still, you know, very very stereotypical, very relying on the same old kind of tropes. But you know, we're seeing some improvements on that. So that's my take on it.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that video games have come a long way. Of series like Assassin's Creed having main characters that are black characters, and Crisis had a black main character, and they didn't feel stereotypical in any way. But yes, I think that overall the vast majority of video game characters, if you look at series like GTA or those kind of open world games, definitely a lot of those games stereotype people of color. So I think that we do have a lot of work that we have to do.
Yeah, I think we've heard some real good and bad examples there. And one thing, like Mr. Langley mentioned, is we've done some kind of systematic analyses of sort of how much, like looking at things like the top 150 selling games in a given year. And we have found what is probably pretty predictable, but it's probably easy to miss case by case if you don't have a real good broad look too, that white people remain overrepresented in games. If you look at the proportion of white people in the United States and then the proportion of white people in games, there are more of them in games. Meanwhile, blacks, Hispanics, biracial, Native American, Pacific Islanders are underrepresented.
You know, it's interesting. One of the things that I've been thinking about a little as I was preparing for this was wondering if it's hard to see that data from the player's point of view based on the fact that the players choose specific video games. That, for example, if I play Call of Duty, I may actually be experiencing a video game world which is much more diverse than Super Mario. Some games actually do a better job of representational diversity. What do you think?
I think that's true, and I think the kind of game that you play really matters. I think a lot of what because I'm always given the example of like, well, what about indie games? These independent games are doing a lot of innovative, creative things, and folks are absolutely right. You can find a strong female lead. You can find women of color. You can find people of color that are in non-stereotypical roles. And I think the bulk of the research that I do, and I don't want to kind of misrepresent James, but because I cite his work a lot, is like those large top-selling AAA kinds of games. The ones that reach the masses. What is that story that's there? What's that narrative that they are deploying? And I think, for the most part, it's been these very limited, skewed narratives of a lot of groups of color. And again, at some point, at some point in that group's, reality, those representations could be true, right? So I'm not diminishing any of it, saying that, okay, there aren't, black criminals. I'm not saying that, but whenever you're constantly seeing just that limited narrative, that skewed narrative, when you see it in the news, when you see it on the movies, when you see those things like over time, and especially for people who don't have diverse lives. So if you don't ever see any of these people in your day-to-day life to be able to discount, those narratives, they start to become true. So I think that's where a lot of the work that I do, I think that's the power that video games kind of have, to kind of perpetuate these certain assumptions about certain groups. And I think that's where some of the danger comes in, that I wish like a lot of these companies that, would kind of take it on, like, okay, maybe we can lessen this kind of trope or this narrative some. But I think, and I'm thinking about, some recent games that just came out. So Mafia 3, I haven't played it all the way through. I don't really have an opinion of it yet, so it's cool to see, but it has fallen into that same trope of a shooter, just kind of open world kind of shooter kind of thing. And also, I was excited to see Battlefield 1. So again, I'm still thinking about what consuming that I don't know, I don't want to spoil anybody's experience of the game, but consuming that much Black Death and having no control over it in the beginning, that I'm still thinking about how to process that. Again, I don't want to do any spoilers here. I don't want to mess up the game for anybody, but I can go into that a lot more if people want to hear about what that consumption of Black Death right in the opening actually means.
Mm, mm. Well, you've given us a spoiler alert, Kishana, so go for it. Why
Yes, please.
If you're playing Battlefield 1, you haven't gotten there yet. Go ahead, Kishana.
Yeah, so you should get Battlefield 1. Battlefield 1, actually on the cover, it's a black man. I can't remember what infantry it is or what unit that was, but it was an all black unit during the war, that were kind of like sent out as like the first wave of kind of things. I'm so sorry I don't have the name of them right now. It's not Buffalo Soldiers, it's somebody else. But basically, the game tells you, hey, you're not gonna survive this. You're gonna die. And that was the first time that a game has ever given you that disclaimer. I've never seen that before, right? So here you are as a black character, you're in the battlefield, you're looking, for the enemy, to shoot. And then so you engage in a little bit of battle, and then you die. And so once you die, you're given the stats of this person, the name, where they're from, where they died, and then you spawn as another black soldier. And it goes through the same thing. And that continues for a lot, that you're just existing in their reality for a couple minutes, and then you die. Like that hyperconsumption of Black Death, it made me think about, how we consume Black Death, like in social media right now, about like a lot of our social movements, like around Black Lives Matter, and this overconsumption and oversaturation of what that means. Like, what are we doing about that other than just consuming it? So that's the spoiler. I'm still processing, what that actually means.
So that's a powerful example, and you wonder, is the intent to create a moment of empathy, or is the and is the byproduct actually something that's more desensitized? What do you guys think?
I know less about that specific game. I think one of Dr. Gray's points, I think, is a useful one, that when you look at improving situations, I think a lot of times people call to mind specific examples, and they are good examples of games, especially like Dr. Gray mentioned, like independent games that represent things better or more accurately or in better proportion. And then I think the unfortunate side of that is a lot of times the industry might have a few examples that get trotted out by people as evidence that things are good when the overall portrayal is still not enough or bad. So it's a complicated thing, I think, for researchers and critics to kind of celebrate good or better examples or more thoughtful examples without giving people an excuse to say, see, everything's fine. And this is a pattern we've seen play out in other media. We still have, overall, we still have disproportionate representations of race in movies and television, especially in main characters. And throughout things like the late 70s and 80s, we saw examples where a few sort of token television programs were used to prop up proportions and say, look, our portrayals are better now, while most of the shows just kind of kept along business as usual. And I think I think Dr. Gray is giving an example where a few good examples hopefully should be sort of an example of how things are changing, rather than a few examples that let everything else just sort of keep going along as is. And I think without knowing as much about the specifics of some of the narratives, I think that's one kind of context that we need for all these examples, is they are just unfortunately sort of counter examples of the trend, right?
Yeah.
One more Battlefield story, but just from a clinical point of view, is for about half a year I was playing Battlefield 3, the campaign, with one of my patients who's actually a biracial patient. And what was the meaning for him, and what were we watching, where basically all of the brown people are dying. That's sort of the message that he's getting. And how does that filter into his formation of a biracial identity? There's so many different ways to come at this, from sort of the cultural critique or the larger scope, but also down to the clinical. But I wanted to maybe go to the next question that I know James had some ideas about. And Price, I want to have you kind of jump in on here as well. One thing that James was curious about was the increase in things like sandbox games, to paraphrase you, and customizable avatars, in terms of, as opposed to content and mechanics that are determined by game designers. How does that change the nature of concerns about issues related to race? And one way I kind of worry or think about it is, does this actually allow us more opportunity to project our racism and create hateful narratives because we're able to design these game worlds?
Yeah, I think that it likely does, and I think that I imagine a lot of the choices that are available to players might not actually be that broad. Um, um, in my experience, because working in the game industry, a lot of the developers I've worked with have been obviously predominantly white men. Um, a lot of times I feel that they don't really offer a lot of opportunity or choices to people in terms of what they can actually create, what kind of experiences they can create, because a lot of their own inherent racism does show up in the development of the actual products. I worked on a sandbox game once, and one of the things that was occurring in the team I was working in, we were seeing a lot of the biases of the development team actually showing up in what we were doing, the choices that we were making in the development of the game. So a lot of times I didn't feel like the player actually did have choices.
And how do you call that out? I mean, or do you, when you're developing a game?
Yeah, I mean, it was something. It was an ongoing conversation in the development of the game. It was an Activision game, and it was something that we were struggling with as a team. And there were a few of us within the team that were talking about that. Like, you know, there were some people that were at the decision-making level that were really saying, like, no, this is what consumers want. This is the kind of things that they want, and we more in the trenches were kind of saying, like, no, we don't think so. We think that there's a broader sort of choice set that people would want, but it was a difficult struggle that was happening. So we were kind of running into this block, because people's biases were showing up in the creation of the game.
I want to I think that's fascinating what you brought up, Price, because I always ask whenever I get a chance to be able to talk with like these development teams, and whatever their default responses are to go back to what's gonna sell, what do people want, and I think a lot, especially because a lot of them don't have that much detailed feedback about what their audiences actually want. They're just going based on what has sold. So then they think that that's what, people want without sitting down and having focus groups, bringing in actually, allowing somebody to think through a game before, you're actually created it. I know they talk about like the beta testing whole, industry or whatever, but I'm like, that's after you've created something, and so there's only very, very little that person can have influence on. But I think it's selling gamers short, and it's also kind of disrespectful to gamers, if you will, just thinking that they can only consume certain stories and certain narratives, not wanting to push them further. So I think all gamers should ask and demand more of, these development teams. And I get so disappointed whenever I see in these spaces where anything is possible. You can create any world, going beyond, your imagination, and we still get the same old kinds of things. And we're paying a lot of money for them. You're paying $60 and $70 now, and then you have to pay for downloadable content. I'm like, we should be demanding that we get more, And I dread getting I'm not going to call any game out, but there's a game I don't want to buy right now because I'm like, I know exactly what this is going to. I'm going to Call of Duty. Call of Duty can do better, I'm just so disappointed because it's one of my favorite games. It's one of the first shooters I ever played. I've played every installation, but these last three it's been a chore, and I had to actually justify why I was purchasing it. I'm like, what, they could be doing more, but I always wondered what are those conversations like that you mentioned, Price, about there at the design innovation kind of level. What are we going to do next, folks? What are we going to do? So I'm fascinated to hear that there are those conversations happening, but it seems to be some pushback too about what the decision makers are actually gonna do.
Well, let me jump in here because one of the places these conversations are not happening is, hello, social workers, I'm talking to you. We need to be when our patients and our clients are actually consuming this media and actually playing some of these games, and we're seeing some of these racial tropes. We need to be saying, huh, what do you think that's about? What does that mean? Like a lot of times, youth, especially in adolescents, are coming in looking to adults to help them turn a critical eye to things. And we miss it. We get so obsessed with how many hours are you playing rather than saying, hey, I don't not accept that you play video games, but the content you're consuming is not all equal, and I've got some concerns about certain things. So some of this is an opportunity that I think, my colleagues and I are missing because we're so obsessed with whether people are playing too much or getting more violent that we're not actually stopping to help them think critically about what the content is.
Exactly. I think, go ahead, my bad. I didn't want to
No. So I guess, Kashana, my next question was actually one I was going to start with you, but I want you all to kind of jump in. Are there any games that you've noticed that are actually subversive in a good way in terms of helping people rethink some of this stuff?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. And I want to go back first off to what you had just said about tapping into these different fields and these different areas to get more interested in video games. I remember growing up, I've been a lifelong gamer, and I played video games because my mom didn't want us going out to get into trouble, so it kept us out of trouble, right? But I also, social workers were very visible and prominent in my life, right? And my mother was always blamed, for like, hey, you're not engaging your child in more, creative kinds of things, so as you said, it was like this limited view and this limited narrative of video games, especially like in this social worker lens. So I'm glad that we're having this conversation so they can get a sense of the significance of them, the importance of them, and how they're much more than just like this addiction kind of, destroying kids' brains kind of narrative. So thank you for that, and I'm really glad to be a part of this space to do that. Regarding, kind of these images that kind of like, I guess, like not stereotypical ones, like these images that do well, is that what you're asking, Mike?
Yeah, something that gives people actually to unlearn racism to a degree by playing the game.
So in the lab, I bring in a lot of video games to talk about controversial topics, right? And I think right now it's kind of timely. This one game that we discussed in class. So my previous group of students that I had, they were criminal justice professionals. They were going to go into law enforcement, something like that. So a lot of them had expressed interest in being border patrol agents, right? So in order to have that tough conversation with them about what the reality of actually, policing a border looks like, we played one of the, I can't remember the name of the game, but it was one of the Games for Change kind of game where you actually see that human side of crossing a border and actually see what is involved with people starving, being thirsty, dying, and then you as a border patrol officer coming along and adding to that process. So it kind of humanized the experience of a border crosser. And I thought that was really useful and innovative. And again, I don't see a lot of those kinds of examples within the games that we're talking about, like within the AAA industry. But Games for Change are really a great place to kind of develop that empathy that I'm hoping to get for a lot of my future professionals in different fields.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that there are a lot of great indie games and serious games that are doing work. As far as a AAA example, one that springs to mind is BioShock Infinite. I think that it took on, I don't know if it really necessarily countered racism, but it took on the issue head on, at least. And I think that it deserves being recognized for that, because that was the central theme of the game, was an oppressive society, a racially oppressive society, and taking that on and having players have to confront it, whereas most video games don't do that, for sure. So I think that like having that be the central theme was powerful.
Jimmy, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think sometimes I have done a lot more research on sort of broad trends than specific examples. I also think probably the last thing the world needs is one more white guy telling people what good and bad portrayals of people in color are without understanding everything about it. But I think one example worth talking about is probably it might be one of those that got more attention from critics and people who weren't even interested in video games than it actually got within the industry. Was sort of a like open world, just sort of try to survive in the environment game called Rust that got some attention because I believe your superficial attributes were sort of basically randomly assigned. You couldn't decide what your character looked like, including race. My sense, though, is that I don't know if that's subversive or if it even helps or not. I think it's interesting, but do you have sort of, I don't want to borrow Van Jones's word, but like a white lash where people will be annoyed that they're being forced to have different kinds of characters, and because of that, basically, you know, sort of have the same sort of white resentment that makes them say, see, this is, everybody's forcing me to do this and that, so I'm going to be more racist than ever. So I'm not sure if that's a good example or not. I think it's a provocative one. And I think it probably shows how it's difficult to structurally fix these things. Again, I think a lot about no matter how good the examples are, the big trends present a certain environment that people look at and say, this is what characters look like, even if I can think of a better game. And I think another thing that maybe isn't as relevant to this question, but the last one, I think maybe social workers and people in the social sciences in general, probably what we could really do to fix that less than design is to show people what this probably does. I know lab-type experiments haven't necessarily done a real conclusive job because I think it's hard to pin down things like racism and stereotyping with like a Likert-type scale, but I think about like Kenneth and Mamie Clark with the dolls studies a long time ago in the 40s where they basically documented showing these minority kids black and white dolls and kind of capturing sort of this self-hatred that came from sort of from society, but also through the makeup of their toys and things like that. And I think I worry that we might have a similar environment right now where people look at what characters are worth something in the broad landscape. And I think that's probably what we need to do is figure out more of what that does to people, which might help turn around and say, what is a good way to fix that? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, go ahead.
Mike,
yeah, sure.
I'm sorry. I think it's fascinating that you brought up, the doll test, because I know in Adrienne Shaw's work, I use her work a whole lot. She actually found that most gamers didn't really care about the stereotyping. Even gamers of color didn't care that they were consuming, these stereotypical kinds of characters, within the game. And I thought that was, I guess that's been most of our experience, within gaming, because I didn't care. I've played it. And I played Street Fighter, with their atrocious narratives, especially of third world folks and, people of color as well. I've consumed all these games. And it wasn't until, I developed some kind of like the digital literacy aspect of it. I developed that and realized, how impactful, consuming those narratives was, especially for my own value and my own work. And wanting to see me, because at first I was like, I didn't care. I don't care if I play Lara Croft. I don't care if she's black or white or whatever, But I think it started to matter once I realized that, hey, the damaging impact that a lot of these representations can have, and the connection of those that negative representation to marginalization and exploitation, and how it's led to some violence, whether it's digital violence or actual violence. Real violence that we saw, happening, with the rise of the alt-right in gaming and Gamergate, so I think it's really important that we realize how impactful this constant framing of certain groups as undesirable or unrepresented is actually happening. So yeah, that's a great point that you bring up, James.
Yeah, those are the questions I have. I wonder if the representations sort of get normalized so much that people don't realize what it does do, what those representations do to them. And I don't know the answer, but I feel like that could be happening.
Well, I think the angle that I kind of take this from is somebody that both does therapy but also thinks about the phenomenology of video games. And the phenomenology of a game is that we're thrown into this strange world and we're trying to make sense of it. So that, for example, I'll call out World of Warcraft. If I'm feeling kind of thrown into the world of Warcraft and suddenly I see these goblins, and the goblins have this kind of Brooklyny, Jewishy accent, and they happen to be obsessed with money, I stereotype because it helps me find my way in the world. And I think that's what you're talking about, is people are actually playing video games and they're trying to master the game. And in mastering the game, they're consuming these stereotypes. So, you know, I know we want to spend time talking about the industry as well, but I want to call out all you researchers now. Okay, you've told us about some of this research, but tell me, what do you think social workers, whether they're counselors or case managers, what do you think they need to do in terms of thinking about video games and race? What can social workers do?
One thing that I think is important is actually get a sense of, you know, why, you know, the folks, their clients, or, you know, the young people that they're involved in are playing the games, because a lot of it is therapeutic purposes. I know a lot of, especially for, you know, I remember working with a lot of kids with, it was a hard living community. You know, some people may call it like an inner city, you know, kind of context that I was existing in, but it was an escape. You know, these were Black nerds, you know, at their core of them, you know, and they were like escaping from the realities of their neighborhood, and they used video games to do that. And then here they were getting demonized and punished for anything that they did. If they were out, you know, out too late in the streets, they were demonized and punished. If they were in the house playing video games, you know, they were punished. They were like, we just want to be kids and exist and live. So I think really asking, you know, the why of somebody is interacting and playing those games, you know, is important. But that the therapeutic nature of it, you know, because I'm thinking back to whenever I was playing and why I played, and I think that's really an important question to ask.
So what I'm doing right now,
And it could also be used, since nobody else is chiming in, also thinking about the ways in which how gaming can get folks involved into like tech fields, you know, STEM. I don't want to throw STEM in there, you know, taken away from social work or whatever, but really to see how, you know, a lot of people, you know, I don't know Price's, you know, story like with his, you know, going into that, but it's probably, you know, began playing games as a kid and saying, hey, I can do that better, you know, I want to be involved in that. And so that's another thing that, you know, we do like in the lab is really get students, get young people interested in gaming as a career, you know, to create and produce. And so hopefully that's meaningful. Hopefully that's helpful as well.
So it sounds like we're starting to head into talking about the industry. Last thoughts, Jimmy and Price, about what social workers can do in terms of looking at race representation in games before we go there?
I can say I'm a little reluctant to tell social workers what to do in general, but I do think if they are
Smart man.
they're interested in looking at video games and media diets as a way to do their work, I think there's probably opportunities to sort of ask them about their play and the characters they play with and things, because a limited experience from looking at some studies that people do where they either do sort of ethnographic type studies and after school programs and things, not just with video games, but with the kind of internet content that children consume, is that they seem to say a lot about themselves by talking about the characters they like and things. I remember a study by a UCLA professor where they did an after-school program, and the kids talked about different wrestling characters and things, and it said a lot about what ideas they were being sold, what they valued, what they thought they should value. So I think if people want to understand what's going on with kids in some of these environments, it's probably useful to ask them about the sort of video games they play, and then ask them more about what those characters are like, because I think they're probably telling you something about what they're being sold to believe. You know, the answers to that, I'd be more interested in hearing what social workers find out from that, so we can figure out how to make it better. And I do want to make sure I'm not taking away from Mr. Jones's time there, since he's had some time with the industry side of it.
Yeah, I want to piggyback on what you're saying, and another thing that I'd like to find out from social workers is the questions they might ask young people playing games about the choices that are available to them in the games. One of the things I see in games a lot, obviously, is that, you know, a lot of times violence is the ultimate choice or decision that you can make, and solve things through violence. And sometimes when I have two sons, they're 13 and 11. And I talk to my sons about the choices that they can make in the games, and they often say to me they wish they could make choices that aren't violent, you know. And I think that they can solve things through not using violence. And I find that also when I talk to my students, they say things like that too. Even though that I think that a lot of times they're you know, conditioned to know that violence is maybe the way you ultimately have to deal with things in video games, or that's what they're conditioned to expect. A lot of times they're like, oh, no, you know, I wish I could, you know, I could talk my way out of the situation in the game. You know, so I think that if like social workers are coming at, you know, like asking people those kind of questions, maybe, like how might you solve this situation differently? Should game designers be offering you these kind of choices? Then I think that could be really useful for the industry to know.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of conversations on powerlessness and freedom that could be had in that.
Yeah.
All right, so now I want to turn our conversation to the topic of the employment in the video game industry and what you all see as the state of race in it. Price, I suspect you have your ear to the ground on this one, so can we start with you?
Sure. Yeah. I see definitely the industry is becoming, I say definitely, it's becoming more diverse. I go to the GDC, which is the Game Developers Conference in San Francisco. I go every year. It's right here next to the Academy of Art. And every year the demographic changes. There's more women entering the industry more and more. There are more people of color, but very few. I mean, as far as the sector of tech goes, the video game industry is still overwhelmingly white and male, whereas other areas of tech have a lot more Asians. There are probably more women in other areas of tech. But the video game industry is disproportionately white male. But I do see shifts happening. I think more people are open to video games. I think younger people obviously are growing up playing games, and so I think that they embrace interactive experience and content as a part of their as part of what they want and their go-to in terms of entertainment. So it is shifting. So the industry is changing, but like most of the Bay Area studios that I see are still made. Those games are being made by men and white men. Yeah.
Of course, as Price said, it's still mostly a white and male industry, right? And I think the question that I would have is, maybe not why it's not diversifying has a lot to say about the culture of development, right? Of tech in general, and then, game development is just an aspect of that. So there was a recent book, I can never remember people's names when I need to remember it, but this woman, she did a wonderful job exploring, the experiences of women in game development, right? And of course, it's as we would assume it would be, very exclusionary, very sexist, very, paternalistic, very, all those things, still exist. So even if we successfully diversify these spaces, you have to think about what are their experiences once they get in there. And it's also the case with, people of color, I mean, it's a workplace. There's discrimination in workplaces, harassment, being devalued, ideas being stolen. So I think, a lot of people think that, just diversifying these spaces will fix it. Well, no, that's not the case at all. And I remember hearing a story from a woman of color. She's working in, I'm not going to say where she works at, but even at the table, the creation table, where she hopes that she could be valued because of what she does, she's not. They discount her ideas, they diminish her ideas, and she says, she could say something, and then if a dude says it after, then they'll be like, oh yeah, that's a great idea, bro, let's do that. So even I think these are still spaces that are highly very masculine, and so we have to transform the spaces to even be welcome to those different bodies, to even be welcome to those different ideas. How we do that, I'm not sure. But I think it's even one of those conversations about diversifying law enforcement, diversifying social work, diversifying all these fields. May not change some of those practices that have been rooted in the history of these fields of exclusion, of racism, of sexism. We're still embedded and complicit in those structures, right? So it's going to have to be like an awareness first. These industries are going to have to be aware that that's a problem, and start to to try to break down some of those barriers. We'll get there. We'll get there.
And again, this is one of my things for social workers. Hello, social workers. This is something we need to do something about. I can't tell you anecdotally. I hear my white patients talking about coding. I hear my Asian patients talking about coding. I don't hear my Black and Latino patients talking about coding as much, and I don't think it's because somehow they're not as able to do it. I think that we're not giving the same messages in education, and it may be that a social worker is the only person to say, hey, you like Call of Duty so much, have you ever thought about being one of the people that makes it? And I think that that's where I get worried, where social workers dismiss or don't know about technology. They may not actually help people. And in our last presentation, we were talking about this, and the difference between, you know, playing a video game or designing it and designing it is the difference between, do you want to be reading everybody else's stories, or do you want to have the power to write and have the world read your story? And so it becomes, for me, a very strong connection between, am I telling my patients that this is possible for you, that you can learn to code, you can learn to design, you can make worlds that other people will consume and that other people will learn. And I think that's a very social worky thing to do, and I don't think enough of us are doing it. Jimmy, what did you think? Go ahead.
Go ahead, Dr. Gray.
It's just one thing that maybe something social workers could do. Like, I'm thinking about, like, your training. You know, I don't know anything about social work. I have great friends that are social workers, and they do amazing things. I'm thinking about, like, in the training process, like, do you all, like, use technology or games, like in training? Because it's some tough topics that you all talk about and engage and experience. So what's, like, that training model that you all have in social work?
Well, UB, I'm going to give a shout out to us, because we actually have the first and only online graduate level course in social work and technology, which yours truly teaches. We also have the only online course using Minecraft and learning how to do play therapy with Minecraft. So UB's doing it, but we're the exception that proves the rule. Most of my colleagues are really more stuck with trying to figure out how many hours you're doing something and is it going to make you shoot people, rather than what does it mean for people to be playing, and what how can this help them change the world?
My bad. James, my bad. Didn't mean to cut you off.
No, you're fine. Back on your earlier question about sort of the state of the industry and the demographic makeup of it, I think we heard some things about sort of the state of things. I can't say for sure, but my instinct is that I think we're also going to see a little bit of a lack of attention on problems beyond just the numbers. So as the diversity gets better on paper, which it sounds like it has a ways to go, I think we'll also still have the problem of, even when we have people of color and women, they've come through with a hobby, a passion that they really like, and it's been normalized to them. So a lot of them are either deliberately or just in the interest of not rocking the boat, maybe going along with the way things have been done before. So an analogy, not to conflate race and sex, but we definitely have lots of women in the workplace, right? And it's still very bad, right? So a lot of women in the workplace have to adapt. Okay, not take care of your kids long enough because there's not a culture of maternity leave, and the men will criticize you if you go home to take care of your kids after birth and things like that. So my instinct is it's very possible we'll have a similar problem where there's increases in people of color in the industry. There's increases even in maybe characters on paper, but there's sort of might still be pressure, even sort of implicit, not on purpose pressure types of things, to keep the portrayals as people grew up with, because it's one thing to bring people into an environment, but it's another thing to let the environment change for them. So my suspicion is we might see a lot of attention to the change in the demographics, and not a lot of attention to how much that change in demographics is allowed to change the industry. And I think, again, that's part of the same thing that Dr. Gray's brought up a few times, this sort of a hobby interest people really grow up with, identify with, etc. And I think that might make it easy to defend the way it was instead of changing it by saying, I love the video games I grew up with, and that might make it harder to face the problems with them.
Yeah. No, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I think that's totally like right on. I think that, and Dr. Gray was speaking to this too, is the idea of changing the space and the spaces in which these things are made. And I think that in the Bay Area, one of the things that's great is that the conversation about diverse groups being open to coding or having opportunities to code is really prevalent. I think a lot of Black and brown kids, boys and girls, are exposed to coding, but I know that the Bay Area is a bit of a bubble, culturally in the U.S., and I think that those kinds of things aren't necessarily widespread. I wish they were more so, but I see them happening here. That kids have these opportunities, and I think what happens is they do change the spaces. They create their own subspaces that aren't necessarily exactly like, definitely not like, and not even, based on blueprints offered by the mainstream industry. They're creating totally different spaces. And I think that as that kind of grows, hopefully, I think that will change what's happening. Because I agree, as long as we're following the current blueprint, it doesn't really matter, how many women get into the industry, how many black people get into the industry. They're going to probably fall in line and, maintain status quo. So, yeah.
And social workers need to be thinking here about this in terms of prevention. If we are not giving people the encouragement and interest and the opportunity to get into one of the largest growing industries, they are going to be left behind. They're going to be systematically disenfranchised. And the video game industry is a huge industry, and it's growing. And so we want people to be able to rise themselves up out of poverty and get more power by actually, teaching them that this is something that can happen. And I do think you're in a bubble price. No offense. I think one of the things we're going to try to be proposing for Buffalo in the next few months is doing one more talk on this in terms of coding and the idea of coding for people that are incarcerated. But in the back of my mind, that's too late. Some of these folks should have gotten it prior to that so they could see they had a way out of poverty, and that's where prevention is part of this. So that, who knew video games would actually be a form of prevention of poverty, but I think it's true. Guys, I want us to have saved like 5 minutes for questions, but I also know you probably have thoughts about the election. Price, I want you to start with it. Do you think it's the responsibility of developers as artists to use their talents to create change in light of this election through video games?
I do. I just want to say real quickly to a point you just made. I don't necessarily think that once somebody's incarcerated, that's necessarily too late. I think that yes, it would be great if it happened before that, so to prevent that the choices that's often people make that get them incarcerated. But I think that a lot of times people, once they're incarcerated, sometimes the world opens up in different ways, and other choices are presented to them. I think that having the opportunity to learn how to code or to, tell your story in different ways post-incarceration is awesome. And I think that, like, a lot of times those people come back into society and make really powerful choices and make really powerful contributors. So I just want to say that.
Fair point. I meant both and, actually.
Okay. Right on. That's cool. Yes, I think that it's totally essential that creative people use their talents to change, make change, affect change in society, and speak out about people's, concern and angst. I think it's incumbent upon artists and designers to do that. I was looking at this really great a billboard that's in Mississippi right now that says "Make America Great Again," and the words are superimposed over a photo from the civil rights era. There's a standoff between civil rights marchers and the police, a group of police, and it says "Make America Great Again," and it's really sparking this conversation in Mississippi. And I think that's spreading across the country, and I want to see more of that kind of stuff. So yes, I think it's really important now for people making video games, especially, even mass consumed entertainment, to also do that kind of thing and take a stand.
Other thoughts before I open us up to questions?
Yeah, I think I have I have a lot of thoughts about the election. I think generally speaking, there's a couple things that come to mind related to this. I actually was just talking about this to some people here the other day. It was sometimes I get to wondering, whether some of the things I do in this area are worth the money that I'm paid, because it's just, we know there's sexist and racist portrayals, and I keep finding the same thing over and over again. But then looking at this election, I can respect why people might vote a certain way on some policy lines about free trade and various kind of economic things and a few other areas, but whether or not that was worth it to people, we did elect like a vocal, misogynist, racist, xenophobic person. And I think that we already have a problem with sort of online dialogue in games. Another study we did found, watching people talk while they played games like Call of Duty, like between 1, 2, 5, and 100 would say things like racial slurs, sexual orientation slurs. And you think about it, that's a lot, even if it's 1 or 2 or 5 out of 100. It's a lot to encounter if you play with 200 people a day or something. So I think we need to look at, what games play and all that, the environment here where we have either a lot of people who are sort of openly kind of feel this sort of hate, or people who at least think it's not important enough to worry about when they vote. And we definitely had a lot of people that were in one of those two categories. I'm hopeful that will change. The other thing I think about is, I mentioned that with that one game that I mentioned as maybe an interesting example, is I think this election did have an undercurrent of, there's a lot of sort of wide identity resentment to programs that I don't think merit that resentment. But I think it tells us that we do want to be proactive about changing representations, changing cultures, but we need to figure out a way to do that in a way that somehow diffuses this resentment also, because it seems like, and maybe it's unavoidable that change is going to bring resentment, but we do obviously see a huge example that has surprised me, the extent of it, where there are people that get out and out resentful when you try to change things about topics like race. They shouldn't, but it would be very good if we can figure out a way to make that change. I don't know if we can stop the resentment or figure out a way to deal with it, but it sounds like it's going to happen when we make changes.
Shauna, did you want to say anything? No. All right. Well, I will hold my tongue too, because I want to make sure we save the last 5 minutes or so for questions. So, all of you in the audience, we've thrown a lot of stuff at you, from research to game development and a little bit of social work from a clinical point of view. What are some questions or thoughts you have?
There's a lot on Twitter I'm seeing.
Mike, there was a question in the chat bar from UB.
Okay, if we're going to create a game, one question is, if we're going to create a game that would facilitate people developing empathy for discrimination, what would that look like? I'm going to start off the answer, then get out of the way. My thing is, I would hope that we would find a way to do that within an existing game that's enjoyable. That I have a real pet peeve about the idea of social workers designing another game that teaches something, because anytime you try to give a person a game that's going to have a point, it gets boring and not fun, and then they're not going to play. So that's my 2 cents. What do you guys think?
I'm in agreement with you. And that could be because coding and creating games is not my skill set. So I'm like, I don't have to make a game. All these awesome games exist already, right? But I like tapping into games that people already find interesting, right? So there was, Mike, as you said, there is some of those games that do a really good job about, like generating that empathy. A lot of people don't find that fun. It seems like it's too much work, to be involved, in that game. So I did it actually. I tried to do it with Grand Theft Auto, and the latest Grand Theft Auto about the hypersensitivity of the police to the black character, for instance, and we compared that to previous games, where the protagonist was a white character, and the police just kind of allowed him to exist, as he wanted. So I use like small examples like that, in the spaces that some of the students are already in, really to keep their interest and to really help them see the point. So, but as opposed to like generating empathy, I don't know. Hopefully, it's possible. I've on that real intimate kind of level. I'm not sure if we can do it with just, with our thumbs on a controller with a video game. I don't even know if we can do it with augmented reality or virtual reality. I'd like to see, people are trying, so I really like to see that happen, though.
Yeah, I don't know if we can do it with new game types. I imagine we can, and I think that I'm excited to see the people are taking it on. I think about ideas for ways to approach it. I also don't know if we can do it with conventional models either. I'm a big proponent in tangential learning, and using existing games and experiences that people find fun to try to teach something additional. But it's just that sometimes I think that it can get lost, especially considering that a lot of the game experiences that we have that are more mainstream are kind of inherently racist anyway, and like the kind of mechanics are, like skewed toward a kind of Western patriarchal kind of decision making. So I think that it can be tricky to try to like really teach empathy when empathy is not what the game is about. So I think that I don't know, we might have to turn to something new. I think that maybe virtual reality, is that, like maybe putting people in other people's shoes and showing them, firsthand certain kinds of, I don't know. Like, I wonder if suddenly a man was playing a woman, a character that's a woman, and going through the kind of experiences a woman might be, can you really embrace or understand what that's like? I don't know. But I think that it's something we should be trying to do, because I think it's a really powerful, opportunity or possibility. Yeah.
I think as an alternative, and I don't think this is either or, but especially for maybe people who aren't involved in game design, there's the chance for interventions in games. I think a lot of the problems have to do with the way people interact with each other in games in unhealthy ways, and there's really interesting examples out there, from sort of almost performance art to just sort of social action of people, sending messages sometimes counter to the game's message about things like war. And I think you can see people basically probably get involved in a little bit of a movement to just intervene with bad behavior and good messages in games. And I think this can be also done probably by researchers. I think there's a real interesting study that just came out by a guy who basically made Twitter bots that talked to people who used racist language on Twitter, and he found that certain kinds of social sanctioning were effective in changing the way people were tweeting. Unfortunately, if I remember right, one of the things he found was that basically when the Twitter bot was a white guy sanctioning the racists, it worked better. But long story short, I think there's sort of automated, there's group, there's researcher ways to intervene in games, even if you can't change game designs, or just sort of set up communities where it's encouraged to behave better.
Absolutely, and I know we don't have that much time. I'm sorry, I know we don't have that much time, but in the stuff that I've done on Xbox Live, there's a group of essentially white dudes who go and dismantle like a lot of that racist talk and racist speech, because they are more impactful. I guess I don't know if there's research that shows that people are more apt to respond to people that sound and look like them. So they've been great allies, to really do something about sexism and racism within Xbox Live in particular. So yeah.
Well, I mean, a couple of things. Jimmy, actually, the data was even more interesting. It wasn't just white men. It was the subset of bots that were white men that had more followers. So
That's
it's
right,
not just being white, it's having more followers. The other thing I want to sort of mention is that some of the statistics from Pew that I thought were interesting was, yes, a large number of people reported hearing hate speech in online and video game communities, but a higher amount of pushback was heard there than what we hear in daily life. That I think is interesting. And a couple projects I'm doing that I think hopefully can help with this is using Minecraft for social emotional learning. And another example is that I'd love to see one of my social work students over there in the audience, maybe you could do this, but I'd love to see us have a curriculum that we can have people learn how they can talk back to hate speech when they hear it when they're playing. So we have time for another question. Does anyone have one over there? I see people tweeting and typing, but I don't know
Are there differences between gamers who play just sports games and the ones that play the role-playing games?
That's a good question. Did you guys hear that?
Could you repeat it?
Are there differences between gamers who just play sports games all day, like Madden and Live and all of that, and then the ones who play the actual role-playing games and like in the shooter games and stuff like that?
I'll respond. I've seen a difference. There's a huge cultural difference, not with just who plays it, but the kinds of interactions that are had within those spaces. So it's more camaraderie, if you will, in like a lot of the sports games, playing together, interacting with one another, and still that trash talk, but not some of the inflammatory talk that you might hear in the shooters, like Gears of War or Call of Duty. And so I don't know if that's a nature of the kind of people who are in those spaces. And also, for my samples, it showed like a larger number of men of color in the sports games, as opposed to some of the shooters, which were overwhelmingly white male. So I didn't ask questions about that, but there were just some differences. So yeah.
Jimmy, anything you noted?
Yeah, well, I don't want to be redundant with what Dr. Gray said, but we also know the demographics of the different users of sports games and other games are kind of markedly different. So I think that's one area. I think there's a stereotype of sort of young white gamer, but some of the games like the role-playing games are not very young, and some of the games like the audiences of really popular sports games are not very white. And I think one thing we probably do, and even in this conversation, is maybe lump all this stuff together, and there might be some genres that have more problems, some genres that have different problems, and probably disproportionately, my sense is a lot of academics that are real interested in games they're proportionally less interested in sports games than the audience is. So we probably need to, we could probably be more representative in our interests. I don't mean us four, but everybody in general. I see fewer papers about sports games than there probably are people playing them. So that's probably part of this conversation too.
Go ahead, Price.
Oh no, I was just I'm agreeing with that, and I also find in my experience with the industry is that the people who make those games are often different. I find that people of color tend to go develop the sports games more. A lot of developers of Madden and 2K series of games are often, a lot of times black people and brown people, whereas the role-playing games typically are more developed by white males. So, yeah.
I'm fascinated. I know we're running out of time. I'm so sorry. I'm fascinated by that because I'm writing in the next book that I have. I'm writing about how the sports genre has captured blackness in a real way, not just blackface, not just like mop top kind of dreads, but they have really captured, mannerisms of black and brown men in really a meaningful way. So I didn't realize that. So yeah, thank you for that.
No, that's actually something that I think is not surprising to me. But I do think that you're also alluding to something that I want to kind of leave my social work folks with, which is, video games are not one monolithic thing. And again, when we spend so much time focusing on why are you playing a video game, or how many hours are you playing a video game, or video games cause this, or video games are related to that. I mean, think about if you inserted reading and substituted reading for that. Reading doesn't cause just one thing. People don't all read the same book. We haven't read the same book since the Gutenberg Bible, right? So we're now in a point of view now at a point in history where I think it's incumbent on us to start looking at the idea that maybe different people play different video games for different reasons. Some may calm you down, some may make you more anxious, some may make you, live out a fantasy life, some may help you feel like you're achieving something, but it's not one size fits all. So, I hope that this talk has given people the opportunity to think about how complicated this is and how, it does connect directly to the work we're doing in terms of helping people lift themselves up in an environment of racial oppression, become more mindful of stereotypes as part of what, is part of the game world, unfortunately. Any closing thoughts you all want to leave us with?
Keep being awesome. Thank you, social worker. We love you. We love social workers. Absolutely. Any way that we can support you all, please let us know. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks to all of you, and I can visit with people later. I think again it's worth pointing out that if you look at what people are doing with their video games and ask them about what they think of the characters and things like that, you can learn a lot about them. And even if the messages aren't great, it's still a good vehicle to learn about what people think of them.
I want to thank you for having this and having me as a part of this. This roundtable has been really wonderful. And yes, I'd like to connect with you all afterwards. I have a selfish interest in this. I'm working on a video games and society class here at the Academy. So I would love to touch base with you and get your thoughts about as I develop this class.
Okay. Well, I'd like to thank Kishonna, Jim, and Price for joining me this afternoon, and I want to thank you all for attending today's webinar. If you have any other questions about the webinar or future events, you can contact us at sw-events@buffalo.edu. Please keep an eye out for us on Twitter and Facebook by following at Social Work Tech Now, that's at SW Tech Now, and at UBSSW, or you can check us out on Facebook. Once you leave today's webinar, you'll also receive a follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours with a link to view a recording of today's webinar. For future social work tech webinars, we plan to offer CEUs, if possible, to New York State social workers. I'd like to thank the UB community and especially the generous support of Dean Smith and the UB Foundation, which helped make this programming possible, as well as Dr. Weaver for her help and oversight. To all of you, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.
Yeah.